There is a ceasefire between the United States and Iran, at least on paper. The missiles have slowed, the public threats have cooled, diplomats are talking again, markets are trying to breathe, and for a brief moment the world is being told that the crisis may be under control. But underneath that temporary calm, the deeper conflict has not disappeared. It has only changed shape. Because the real question is not whether Washington and Tehran can pause the fighting for a few days or a few weeks. The real question is whether the two sides can actually reach a settlement that both can live with. And right now, that looks extremely difficult. The United States wants Iran weakened, contained, and forced back from the edge of nuclear capability. Iran wants survival, sovereignty, regional leverage, and proof that it cannot be bullied into submission. Those goals do not easily fit together. That is why many analysts believe the ceasefire may not be the end of the war. It may simply be the intermission before the next phase begins. And if the fighting resumes, it may not look like the wars people expect. It may not begin with a full-scale invasion. It may not involve hundreds of thousands of American troops crossing into Iran. It may not produce one dramatic battlefield moment where one army collapses and the other raises a flag over the capital. Instead, the next phase could be slower, more methodical, and far more dangerous. It could become a 21st century war. And that is what makes this US-Iran confrontation so important. This is not only a crisis in the Middle East, it may be a preview of how major powers fight in the modern world, not by destroying a country all at once, but by making that country economically exhausted, politically unstable, socially divided, and increasingly ungovernable. To understand where this conflict may be heading, we have to understand how war itself has changed. For much of human history, war was relatively simple in concept. You destroyed the enemy's army, two forces met on the battlefield, and whichever side killed more soldiers, broke the enemy formation, or captured the key territory, had the advantage. War was brutal, but the target was usually clear, the opposing military. If you defeated the army, you could force the king, emperor, or ruling power to accept your terms. But the modern nation-state changed that. By the 19th and 20th centuries, war was no longer just a contest between professional armies. It became a contest between entire societies. Governments could mobilize millions of people. Citizens were no longer passive subjects watching kings fight. They became soldiers, workers, taxpayers, engineers, factory laborers, nurses, farmers, and propagandists for the national war effort. That changed everything. Once the population became part of the war machine, it was no longer enough to destroy soldiers at the front. A state could replace soldiers, it could manufacture new weapons, it could mobilize new divisions, it could keep fighting as long as its factories, railways, ports, fuel supplies, food systems, and industrial workforce survived. That is why the 20th century produced a darker kind of war. World War II showed that modern war was not only about the battlefield, it was about the entire productive capacity of the state. Factories became targets, rail lines became targets, oil refineries became targets, cities became targets. Civilian morale became a military objective. The logic was harsh. If the enemy society could no longer produce weapons, move supplies, power its cities, or feed its people, then its army would eventually collapse. That was the brutal lesson of industrial war, but the 21st century has changed the equation again. Today, direct total war between major powers is far more dangerous because of nuclear weapons. A full-scale conventional war can escalate quickly. And if nuclear powers become desperate, the entire world can be pulled toward catastrophe. So instead of total destruction, modern powers increasingly use pressure below the threshold of all-out war. Sanctions, blockades, cyber attacks, drone strikes, covert sabotage, information campaigns, financial isolation, control over shipping lanes, support for internal opposition, pressure on energy systems, pressure on food supply chains, pressure on public trust. In this new model, the goal is not always to occupy the enemy's capital. The goal is to make the enemy state weaker every week until its own population begins to question whether the government can protect them. That is the key. In 21st century warfare, the population becomes the battlefield. Not because every civilian is a soldier, but because civilian life is now completely tied to systems that can be disrupted. Electricity, water, fuel, food delivery, banking, internet access, transportation, medicine. and public order. A country can appear strong on the outside and still become fragile if those systems begin to fail. That is why Iran is such an important case. Iran is not an easy target for a classic military campaign. For decades, Tehran has prepared for a confrontation with the United States and Israel. Its leadership structure is designed to survive decapitation. Its missile systems are dispersed, its command networks are not always centralized, its military assets are hidden, mobile, and often embedded in difficult terrain. Many important facilities are underground or protected by geography. Iran has watched American wars for decades. It studied Iraq, it studied Afghanistan, it studied Libya, studied Syria. It knows that if it presents a clean, centralized military target, it becomes vulnerable. So Iran did not build its defense strategy around matching the United States plane for plane, ship for ship, or tank for tank. It built a strategy around survival. That means redundancy, dispersal, proxies, missiles, drones, mines, small boats, underground facilities, regional allies, and the ability to keep fighting even after suffering heavy damage. This is why a simple shock and awe strategy may not be enough. The United States can strike radar systems, it can hit drone launch sites, it can destroy missile batteries, it can target military bases, command centers, storage facilities, and IRGC assets. But that does not automatically end the war. Iran can absorb damage, it can replace commanders, it can move weapons, it can use proxies, it can escalate asymmetrically, it can threaten shipping, it can increase pressure in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, or the Gulf. In other words, Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a traditional military sense. It only needs to survive long enough to make the war politically, economically, and strategically painful. That creates a serious problem for Washington. If military strikes do not force Iran to back down, what comes next? This is where the conflict could move into the next phase, a broader campaign of pressure designed to weaken Iran from the inside. The first part of that strategy would be economic strangulation. So Iran's economy is already vulnerable, sanctions have damaged its financial system, inflation has hurt ordinary people, foreign investment is limited, the currency has faced pressure, and the government depends heavily on energy revenue to fund both domestic stability and regional power projection. Oil is central to that system. If Iran cannot reliably export oil, the state loses money. If shipping becomes risky, buyers hesitate. If insurance costs rise, trade slows. If tankers are blocked, tracked, sanctioned, or attacked, Iran's income falls. The United States does not need to destroy every oil field to create pressure. It only needs to make the system unreliable. That is how strangulation works. One port becomes unsafe. One shipment is delayed. One buyer gets threatened with sanctions. One refinery connection is disrupted. One maritime route becomes too expensive to use over time. The effect builds, revenue drops, imports become harder, prices rise, jobs disappear, public anger grows, and the government is forced to spend more money on security while having less money to stabilize society. That is the economic side of modern war, but economics is only one layer. The second layer is infrastructure pressure. Modern countries are extremely dependent on networks. Electricity grids, water systems, road networks, railways, ports, airports, fuel depots, telecommunications, and food distribution systems all work together. If one system fails, others begin to feel pressure. If fuel distribution breaks down, trucks stop moving. If trucks stop moving, food prices rise. If electricity becomes unreliable, factories slow down. If factories slow down, workers lose income. If water becomes unreliable, cities become angry. If roads and rail hubs are disrupted, the capital becomes harder to supply. That is why infrastructure is so powerful in modern war. You do not need to destroy an entire country. You only need to hit the nodes that make the country function. Single bridge, a rail hub, a fuel terminal, a power station, a communications center, a port facility, or a water system can have effects far beyond the physical damage. And in a country like Iran, where major cities depend on complex supply lines, the pressure can build quickly. Tehran, for example, is a massive urban center. It does not feed itself. It relies on food, fuel, goods, and services moving in from elsewhere. If transportation networks are disrupted, daily life becomes harder. If daily life becomes harder, anger rises, and that anger becomes politically dangerous. This is the cruel logic of 21st century war. The civilian population becomes the pressure point. The official target may be military capability, but the real strategic effect comes from making ordinary people feel that their government can no longer protect their basic needs. That creates the third layer, political and social destabilization. Iran is often described as one state, but inside Iran there are many pressures, ethnic, regional, economic, generational, ideological, and political. There are Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baluch communities, and other groups. There are wealthy urban elites and poor rural regions. There are religious conservatives and younger people who want a different future. There are hardliners and pragmatists. There are people loyal to the system and people who resent it deeply. In normal times, the state can manage these tensions. But during war, economic collapse, and infrastructure failure, every internal tension becomes more dangerous. That is why outside powers often do not need to invent grievances. They only need to amplify existing ones. A protest over prices can become a protest against corruption. A regional complaint can become a separatist movement. A labor strike can become a national crisis. A water shortage can become a political uprising. Social media campaign can turn anger in one city into anger across the country. This does not mean every protest is fake or foreign controlled. Real people have real grievances, but in modern conflict, real grievances can be pushed, funded, shaped, and weaponized. That is why information warfare matters. The battlefield is no longer only in the sky or at sea. It is also on phones, it is in Telegram channels, X-posts, viral videos, leaked documents, edited clips, rumors, slogans, and emotional images that move faster than governments can respond. If Washington can convince enough Iranians that the pain they are experiencing is the fault of their own government, pressure on Tehran increases. If Tehran can convince enough Iranians that the pain is part of a foreign war against the nation, resistance hardens. That is the battle for public meaning, and it may be just as important as the battle for airspace. This is why the next phase of the US-Iran conflict would likely not be a simple military campaign. It would be a pressure campaign with multiple fronts. At sea, the United States would try to limit Iran's ability to threaten shipping while also restricting Iran's own exports. In the air, it would continue targeting drones, missiles, radars, and launch sites. Economically, it would intensify sanctions and pressure buyers of Iranian oil. Politically, it would amplify unrest and internal divisions. Psychologically, it would try to make ordinary Iranians believe the system is leading them into disaster. And strategically, it would force Iran to defend too many things at once. That is the goal: stretch the state, force it to protect its ports, its oil facilities, its power grid, its military bases, its capital, its borders, its ethnic regions, its currency, and its public image all at the same time. No government can do that forever without strain, but Iran is not defenseless. Its response would likely be very different from America's. The United States fights through technology, finance, air power, sanctions, and global networks. Iran fights through endurance, ideology, asymmetric pressure, and regional disruption. If Washington tries to make life inside Iran unbearable, Tehran may respond by making the conflict feel existential. That means the Iranian government would frame the war not as a policy dispute, but as a national survival struggle. The message would be simple: America is not attacking the government, America is attacking Iran itself. That message can be powerful, because when a population believes it is facing humiliation, occupation, or national destruction, even people who dislike their government may still rally around the flag. This is one of the risks Washington faces. External pressure does not always produce rebellion. Sometimes it produces unity. Sanctions do not always make people blame their own leaders. Sometimes they make people blame the foreign power imposing the sanctions. Bombing does not always break morale. Sometimes it hardens it, and Iran has a long memory of war, foreign pressure, coups, sanctions, and regional conflict. Tehran knows how to turn suffering into political messaging. It can say, look, this is what America wants. They want you hungry. They want you afraid. They want you divided. They want you to blame your own country while they destroy it from outside. That kind of message can work, especially during war. And if the pressure becomes severe enough, Iran may lean even harder into religious and nationalist mobilization. More martyrdom language, more resistance rhetoric, more internal crackdowns, more surveillance. More censorship, more arrests, more pressure on dissidents, more warnings that criticism helps the enemy. This is how 21st century war transforms the defending state. The attacker uses pressure to create unrest. The defender uses fear of the attacker to justify control. The attacker says, your government is failing you. The defender says, your enemy is trying to destroy you. And the civilian population is trapped between both narratives. That is the darkest part of this kind of war. It blurs the line between military and civilian life. It turns electricity into a weapon. It turns food prices into a weapon. It turns social media into a weapon. It turns ethnic tension into a weapon. It turns public anger into a weapon. It turns suffering itself into a battlefield. This is why the ceasefire may be misleading. A ceasefire can pause missiles. It can stop airstrikes. It can reduce immediate risk, but it does not solve the deeper confrontation. The United States still wants to prevent Iran from becoming a stronger regional and nuclear power. Iran still wants to prove it can survive American pressure. The Gulf still matters, oil still matters, the Strait of Hormuz still matters, China's energy imports still matter, Israel's security still matters, America's credibility still matters, Iran's internal stability still matters. So the conflict remains alive even when the weapons are temporarily quiet. The next escalation may not arrive as one giant dramatic moment. It may come piece by piece, a drone incident, a tanker confrontation, a strike on a military site, a cyber attack, a blackout, a new sanctions package, a protest in a major Iranian city, a clash in the Gulf, a missile fired by a proxy, a retaliation that is described as defensive, then another, and slowly the ceasefire becomes meaningless. That is how modern escalation often works. Not one declaration of war, not one single invasion, but a chain of incidents that gradually makes peace impossible. The danger is that both sides may believe time is on their side. Washington may believe that pressure will eventually force Tehran to bend. Tehran may believe that endurance will eventually force Washington to back away. But both sides cannot be right. If the United States escalates pressure and Iran refuses to collapse, Washington may face a choice, accept a limited outcome or escalate further. If Iran absorbs pressure but its economy weakens and its population grows angrier, Tehran may face a choice, compromise or crack down harder. Either path is dangerous because the longer this conflict continues, the more likely it becomes that the war expands beyond Iran itself. The Gulf could be pulled in, Iraq could be pulled in, Syria could be pulled in, Lebanon could be pulled in, Yemen could be pulled in, shipping markets could be shaken, oil prices could spike, China could be affected through energy flows, Europe could face economic blowback, and the United States could find itself managing not one crisis, but an entire regional system under stress. That is why this conflict is not just about Iran, it is about the future of American power. Can the United States still use sanctions, air power, naval dominance, and financial pressure to force a hostile state to change behavior? Or has the world entered a period where determined states can absorb punishment, adapt, and survive? Iran is a test case. If Washington succeeds in weakening Iran without a full-scale invasion, that model could influence future confrontations with other adversaries. If Iran survives and emerges politically hardened, that will send a different message. That American pressure can be endured if a state is prepared, decentralized, ideological, and willing to impose pain on its own population. Either outcome matters far beyond the Middle East because this is the future many countries are watching. China is watching, Russia is watching, the Gulf states are watching, Israel is watching, Europe is watching. Every state that fears American pressure is watching. And every state that wants to use American-style pressure is watching too. The lesson is clear. The wars of the 21st century may not look like the wars of the past. They may be slower, they may be quieter, they may be deniable, they may be fought through sanctions, sabotage drones, data ports, currencies, power grids, shipping lanes, and public emotion. But they can still destroy nations. A city does not need to be flattened to be broken. A government does not need to be invaded to be destabilized. A society does not need to be conquered to be pushed toward collapse. That is the new battlefield. And the US-Iran confrontation may be showing us exactly how it works. For now, there is a ceasefire, but ceasefires are fragile when the underlying conflict remains unresolved. And in this case, almost everything remains unresolved. For Iran's nuclear future, America's regional credibility, Israel's security concerns, the balance of power in the Gulf, oil exports, sanctions, proxy networks, domestic unrest, and the question of whether Iran can be forced to bend or whether pressure will only make it more defiant. So the world should not mistake silence for peace. The shooting may have paused, but the pressure campaign is still alive. The economic war is still alive. The information war is still alive. The regional struggle is still alive. And if this conflict resumes, it may not look like a traditional war at all. It may look like a country slowly being squeezed from every direction economically, politically, socially, and psychologically until something inside breaks. That is what makes this moment so dangerous, not because the next war will necessarily be bigger at first, but because it may be harder to see, harder to define, harder to stop, and far easier to spread. This may be the real face of 21st century warfare. Not a single battlefield, not a single front line, not a single decisive victory, but a long campaign to turn a nation's own systems, shortages, divisions, and fears against itself. And if Iran becomes the first major test of that model, the consequences will not end in Tehran. They will echo across the entire world.